Good evening. My name is Brian Leib. I'm the Executive Director of the Iranian Americans for Liberty, and I'm currently sitting in IAL studios right here in Washington, D.C. On behalf of our Board of Directors, our Board of Advisors, and all of our supporters around the country, please allow me to welcome all of you to this evening's virtual congressional meet and greet with Congressman Andy Biggs from Arizona's 5th Congressional District for our 16th virtual congressional meet and greet of this year. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about our organization. The Iranian Americans for Liberty are a bipartisan group of Iranian Americans from all around the nation that are working together to support and strengthen U.S. foreign policy and national security solutions that bring democracy, human rights accountability, and freedom of speech to the Iranians living under the oppressive Islamic Republic of Iran. Please visit our website to learn a little bit more about our organization. And also, please be advised tonight's event is for educational purposes only, and all of our events are free and open to the public for anyone to attend. So at this time, it's my pleasure to kick the program off by introducing tonight's special guest. But before we do that and get into our Q&A with you, I would like to read a very short bio about our evening's special guest. Congressman Andy Biggs is an Arizona native, and he currently is serving in his 3rd term in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Arizona's 5th Congressional District. He lives in Gilbert with his wife of 40 years, Cindy. They have 6 children and 8 grandchildren. And before being elected to Congress, Congressman Biggs served in Arizona's legislature for 14 years, the last 4 of which as Arizona's Senate President. Congressman Biggs is a member of the House Judiciary and Oversight and Reform Committees. He's also the chairman of the House Freedom Caucus, co-chair of the Border Security Caucus, co-chair of the War Powers Caucus, and chief regulatory reform officer of the Western Caucus. So Congressman Biggs, thank you so much for being here with us this evening. I'd like to turn it over to you for some brief opening remarks before we get into our Q&A.
Brian, thanks so much. I mean, I'm grateful to be with you today, grateful to be able to talk about Iran and also the very issues that you said are the organizing principles of your organization. We're talking civil rights, we're talking human rights, and we're talking freedom, things like freedom of speech, assembly, and we know that Iran has had a real tough time of it. And I appreciate what you guys are doing, and I'm honored to be with you today and talk some more about some of these things.
Well, thank you. The honor is all ours, and let's jump into some Q&A here. For our first question, we just briefly talked about all the different caucuses that you're involved with, but one of the ones I would like to dive into is your leadership position on the House Freedom Caucus. You're currently serving as the chairman of this caucus, with previous chairs being former Congressman and Chief of Staff to President Donald Trump, Mark Meadows, and current Ohio Congressman Jim Jordan. So, Congressman, can you tell us a little bit more about the Freedom Caucus and what your objectives are?
Yeah, so the Freedom Caucus came to be about 5.5 years ago because the members at the time looked at it, maybe 6.5 years ago actually, they looked at the way Congress was run and they felt like neither party really was responsive to the people of America. So promises were made, promises were broken. And so they formed initially with about 9 members. They came together and they said, we want to be the voice of America's forgotten citizens who elect people thinking they're going to get certain representation. They don't get it. So that's been our mission. Sometimes it means it's uncomfortable for us because we take on our own leadership sometimes. It's not just attacking the other party, it's attacking our own leadership sometimes and defending our principles and values and trying to keep the promises we've made to the American people.
It's fantastic. If someone wanted to learn a little bit more about the Freedom Caucus, how can they learn more about it?
They can go to our website at housefreedomcaucus.org and they can check us out on all of our social media sites. Don't ask me what those are, Brian. That's not fair. I never remember them all. But look, we put out, we do live streams regularly. We do press conferences regularly. We put out position statements, and we let people know what we're doing. We don't want to ever keep our light hidden. So,
well, fantastic. Keep up the great work in the caucus and all of your caucus members. For our next question, we're going to talk about an issue that is on the minds of millions of Americans and certainly a lot of your constituents back home in Arizona. And first of all, let me just say that we most certainly do have a crisis on our southern border. People want to skirt the issue, but we certainly do have a crisis going on there. And, you know, from day one and on October 8th, you and 33 of your House colleagues sent a very strong letter to President Biden demanding answers about his administration's handling of the border crisis. Can you please tell our audience a little bit more about the situation on the southern border, and has President Biden responded to your letter?
Well, thanks for that. I will just tell you that no, President Biden is not. I'll answer that. That's easy. He's not responded. And that wasn't the only letter I've written to President Biden or to Secretary Mayorkas, who's the Homeland Security Secretary. But to let people understand what's happening, because a lot of times it's hard to really picture this. You have all of California's southern border, all of Arizona's and New Mexico and Texas's southern border. I should say the boot of New Mexico. And that's a little over 2,000 miles long of border. And it's right now very porous. So in Rio Grande Valley, which is McAllen, Texas, right over on the Gulf of Mexico, you'll have anywhere from 2,500 to 3,500 people every day cross the Rio Grande River at that location, and they'll surrender themselves. In Yuma, you're going to get about 650 to 1,000 a day, and that's in southern Arizona, right on the California border. And many of them will surrender. In El Paso, a lot of people will surrender. But every day, about 10,000 people enter the country illegally, about 6,500 surrender, and another 3,500 escape and get away into our country. We don't know where they're from. We don't know what their intentions are. We don't know what their background is. And so you can see about 300,000 people a month are getting in. A year ago, the entire number under President Trump was 458,000 people came into the country and were apprehended illegally. And you had maybe 100,000 gotaways. We're about 1.7 million surrenders or arrests, another 500,000 gotaways this year. This is, you know, and we have crime coming across, we've got drugs coming across. I read an interesting piece today saying, well, we've seized more fentanyl than we ever have before. That's true. We have. And so I give kudos to the Biden administration for that. But the problem is we're still, by the best estimates, only interdicting about 8%. So we did the same, about 8 to 10% under Trump. We're doing 8 to 10% under Biden. And we have a record amount of fentanyl seized, which tells you that the drugs just are proliferating even more. And so you have opioid overdoses and addiction. So I could go on about this for a long time. There are ways to resolve this, Ryan, very simply, very quickly. But right now, this administration's position and policy is, as they campaign, is for an open border.
Well, not shocked that he hasn't responded to that letter or probably to any of your letters, but thank you to you and to your colleagues for stepping up and fighting for your constituents and for what certainly is a crisis happening right now. So thank you for that.
Thanks.
Of course. So for our next question, we'll keep the focus on some domestic policy here and talk a little bit more about American energy. As you might recall, the United States became energy independent for the first time in over 60 years during President Trump's administration. You have an extremely strong record of supporting American energy, and you believe that we should unleash the full potential of United States energy production while ensuring that the federal government doesn't place any unnecessary burdens or regulations on American energy producers. Increasing American energy is not only good for our nation, so we're not reliant on OPEC and other foreign entities, but also it will create thousands of jobs, good-paying jobs for the American people. So tell us a little bit more about your position on American energy, and how do you think we can really finally unleash this full potential here in this nation?
Well, I'm glad you're asking that question, because we actually just had a hearing last week in one of my committees where we brought in the CEOs of all the major gas and oil development companies, the ones you all household names, Exxon, Shell, BP, etc. And the problem is, the current administration's position is that they want a reduction absolutely in carbon emissions, which is fine. We're actually leading the world in carbon emission reduction. That isn't how you unleash it, though. I mean, one of the ways you get carbon emissions reduced is to allow for the development, exploration, and refinement and shipping of natural gas, which is a very low-cost alternative. It's also low carbon. This administration has put the shackles on that. You took the Keystone Pipeline out of production. Keystone Pipeline would have brought oil and gas all the way from Canada down to the Gulf for distribution and transmission. That would have saved money. It would have allowed us to be energy independent still. The other thing that you have to do is you have to acknowledge that nuclear power really is a low cost. It's also a low carbon emissions. It's some of the cleanest energy you can get. We're fighting that because our nation would like to shut down, not our nation, but some in our nation's leadership would like to shut down nuclear expansion. We haven't built anything. We're finally building one in Georgia, but we hadn't done anything for a long time. Those things would unleash our energy independence. And if we're energy independence, a couple things happen. You're feeling inflation. Part of that inflation is because we're no longer energy independent. That's a structural issue we could fix fairly quickly. And if you fix that, it provides the stability in your economy. And we have trouble with that. So in the meantime, as you said, and you're wise to say this, when we're not doing our pipeline and we're not allowing for exploration and development of energy here, you got to have energy. This is a massive country with a massive economy and a disproportionately low share of energy on our vis-a-vis our economy. Well, you know what? Our president went hat in hand to OPEC. And basically, OPEC said we're not going to increase the development and production. And if that's the case, then we get squeezed economically as well. So it's a national security issue, it's an economic security issue, and it's a long-term, a future issue for this country. We've got to do that. We've got to unleash this again.
Well, I'm sure your constituents back home are extremely proud of the work that you're doing on all of those issues that we just mentioned. So for that, those are some of the domestic policy questions. We've got a couple foreign policy questions that we'd like to run by you. The first one being the Islamic Republic of Iran has been chanting death to America, death to Israel, ever since they came to power in 1979. And with the recent sham elections in Iran of Abraham Raisi, he was sworn in as the new president of Iran over the summer. He's a hardliner, by all accounts, Congressman. He's earned the nickname the Butcher for his role in overseeing the execution of thousands of Iranian citizens over the last couple decades. And the Iranians have now indicated that they will soon be getting back to Vienna and negotiating, with us. I'm curious what your perspective is on, do you think that President Biden should continue to engage in diplomacy with another nation that I think you and I can agree doesn't share our values and that wishes for our demise? I mean, should we be negotiating with another country like that?
Well, as an example, recent example, President Trump went to North Korea to negotiate with a dictator that does not share our values, and an indoctrinated citizenry does not share our values generally, as well, as far as we can tell. In Iran, the leadership does not share our values at all, and I think there's some radicalization that's gone on. But I do think the citizens desire to have, prosperity and freedom and be able to fulfill their destiny, what they view as their destiny. But here's the thing, if you're going to engage in diplomacy, you don't engage in that diplomacy from a position of weakness. And this administration has chosen to weaken our relationship vis-a-vis Iran's leaders' goals, ultimate goals. So there was a freeze on certain Iranian leaders' accounts and funding. There was a freeze and sanctions on certain aspects of the government. we just handed that all back. By handing that back, we lose any kind of diplomatic leverage that we might have. And so it's one thing to say, let's engage in diplomacy. It's quite another to go in surrendered already. I mean, everything from the nuclear missile agreement and pulling, and all of those things that we had under Trump. See, I was fine if Trump wanted to engage, because he said, I'm happy to engage in diplomatic relations, diplomatic talks. Why? Because he was talking through strength. And if that's the case, you might be able to get concessions that you otherwise wouldn't. Otherwise, you're the one that's going to be conceding. I don't support us going there hat in hand and actually harming our position, which I think this administration is, as we just saw again with China and Secretary Blinken just 2 days ago, just 2 days ago. That's what I fear most about this administration. They're incompetent at the international relations level. They don't understand international relations at all, in my opinion.
And you're right. I mean, we've lost our leverage. You know, certainly, you know, we're projecting weakness right now. We're negotiating from weakness. And over the summer, just to briefly add, to share with you, the Iranians and the Chinese did a trade deal that saw the Chinese committing $400 billion over the next 25 years into Iran's economy, infrastructure, everything you could possibly think of. Now, $400 billion is a lot of money, of course, any government, $400 billion, but Iran hasn't even seen $4 million over the last 20 years combined of outside investment coming into that country. Sure. So if you have the Chinese promising $400 billion and you have us trying to negotiate with them, we don't really have any leverage, to your point.
No, that's exactly right. And when you start looking at this administration and China, I mean, I'm glad you brought up China, because China is trying to do this all over the world with the Belt and the Road and Belts initiative, right? I mean, they're building roads in Central America right now. They're building them in Africa, in Afghanistan. They're helping the Taliban reinitiate organization, and they're going to get critical minerals out of Afghanistan. We simply, when we go to sit down with Iran, we've basically ceded so much, soft power, even hard power, that it becomes very difficult for whoever's going to be sitting down at that table to get anything meaningful done.
I agree. For our next question, let's keep the focus on the Iranian regime. And on this administration and on the topic of diplomacy. As you might know, as we're talking about, world leaders were in Vienna for around 6 or 7 weeks this summer, having discussions related to the JCPOA or JCPOA 2.0. U.S. Special Envoy to Iran, Robert Malley, who is an Obama alumni, by the way, is currently back in Europe with his team for another round of negotiations. And 2 weeks ago, he publicly stated that the United States and President Biden are prepared to lift every single economic sanction that is currently in place on the Iranian regime just to get them back to the negotiating table. Now,
talk about leverage, giving up leverage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No leverage whatsoever, right? The Iranian regime, now with this hardliner taking power, has stated that they're not going to entertain any conversations with the Biden administration unless we do remove all of our economic sanctions and get back into the JCPOA with no strings attached. Now, there are groups in the U.S. like NIAC, the National Iranian American Council, who believe the U.S. government should do that. They should get back into the JCPOA, not extract any concessions. Now, obviously, us, the Iranian Americans for Liberty, take a much different position on this issue. But I'd like to kick it to you and tell me a little bit more about, do you think that we should be rejoining the JCPOA, lifting all economic sanctions on the regime? What are your thoughts on that?
First of all, I don't think we should be re-entering the JCPOA. I'm not sure what they want to do. They would like to see something happen over there. But the problem is, ultimately, when we go back in there and we have basically said, okay, we're going to give everything you've asked for just to get you to sit down at the table with us, then what's left to give up? I mean, you've basically negotiated against yourself. And that's what the U.S. is doing. This administration is great at that. We'll just, what is it you want? Okay, we'll give that up. Because we could talk about the philosophy, but they really are kind of neoliberal institutionalists. You know, they really believe that sitting down and jawboning is going to get done what needs to get done. And I'm much more of a realist, where you have to show minimum soft power. I'm not an interventionist by any stretch, but I mean, you have to show the power and the cards that you have. I mean, it's the old peace through strength type of thing. And we're not going to, I don't think you're going to get anything that's actually beneficial to rank and file citizens of Iran, or to the United States of America, or frankly anybody else in that region, by giving up everything you have just to get Iran to sit down at the table. I think that's a flawed strategy, and we'll rue the day, 2, 3, 4 years from now, if that really occurs.
Well, I'm glad you brought up peace through strength. I mean, peace through strength is certainly something that had worked in the previous administration, not just with Iran, but with a lot of bad actors all around the world. And I've been personally very vocal on the fact that this administration should take a page out of President Trump's book and start projecting some strength onto the world. And wouldn't it be amazing for that day to come? I don't think it will, but we can wish that day will come. But for our next question, we're going to shift and still keep the focus on the regime. It's widely known that they're funding terrorism all around the world. In recent years, the regime has provided financial and operational support to Hamas and Palestinian Jihad inside of Israel, Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is on Israel's northern border, and the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Over the last couple of months, there were Iranians that were protesting inside of Iran for actually this very reason. The Iranian people are sick and tired of their government spending billions every year, hundreds of millions of dollars every month, funding terrorist proxies around the world, while they don't have access to basic running water, dependable electricity, or a government that has any interest in actually representing them as people. So we witnessed firsthand what happened this summer, and there was another round of protests and people taking to the streets. And of course, by the way, the regime shuts off the internet. So when people do take to the streets, it's really tough to get the message out there. But the question is this: do you stand with the Iranian people who are rising up against the regime, and will you commit to making a separation between the Iranian regime and the Iranian people?
Yeah, I think that's what we've been talking about, is that there are people of goodwill within Iran who want to be free. They want their basic human rights and dignity. This regime is a kind of a follow-up to the last regime, which they don't really have that same respect. So I'm with people anywhere in the world. I mean, another example would be Hong Kong, where people stood up. I support those people. And it becomes kind of an interesting thing. How do you support those folks? And there are ways that we can do that. I mean, a lot of it, sometimes it's going to be soft support, but there has to be support. People need to know that they can look to the United States of America as the light of liberty and trust them. I frankly believe that we have failed so many ways in that regard. If you're not going to at least provide some kind of spiritual support or whatever, I mean, some what I would call asymmetric support, then you shouldn't be encouraging people to do what those folks were doing. And I watched it happen. I mean, whether it's Hong Kong and Iran, I mean, you've got this thing going on almost simultaneously in some respects, and you're just going, and what are we doing? What are we doing? And the administration didn't do much, if anything.
Yeah, there's no doubt, Congressman, that there's so many people all around the world, 2 countries you just mentioned, but all around the world, people that look to the United States of America as a beacon of liberty, a beacon of hope. And when we're sitting on our hands not supporting those people, it's not a good look for our nation. So hopefully that tide will turn at some point.
Yeah, we lose tremendous prestige, and again, we've talked a lot about leverage, but international relations is like serving in Congress is all about leverage and determining what your national security interest is at the international level, and protecting and preserving that interest. And there are ways to provide support. If short of sending in troops, and I think people they think, oh, if you support it, well, then we'll send in troops. There are ways to provide support, and one of those ways is to squeeze off the bad guys who who are attacking these people, these innocents. And we haven't seen the willpower to do that from this administration at all.
Well, that comment's a good segue into our next question. In January of 2020, you penned a very strong op-ed with Congressman Ken Buck that, amongst other things, praised the decision by then President Trump to order the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. Our organization has been very clear that this was the right decision. It was a tough decision, but it was the right decision to make. And we think that the world is a safer place with Soleimani gone. So why do you think some of your colleagues in the House not only just didn't support this move, they went out of their way to condemn the president for this? I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
I'll give you several reasons. First of all, the most obvious reason is that some members of the House just hated Donald Trump, and no matter what he did, they were going to be critical. The second thing is we have a constant battle over Article 1 of the Constitution powers, legislative powers versus executive powers. And the question really, for some people, I think they were of goodwill, I think they were trying to get this understood. They felt that that might have exceeded Article 2's powers, that the president did not have that authority, even under the AUMF, which is the authorization to use military force, either of the ones that were in existence at the time of Soleimani's assassination. My position was, and Ken's, Representative Buck, the reason we wrote that is because when we looked at it and examined this, we think the Commander-in-Chief has the ability under Article 2 and has the authority to engage in immediate actions to protect and preserve the basically self-defense for the United States of America after our interest is defined. Our interest was defined, and this guy had been killing and was actively planning additional operations against our troops, and so it was a self-defensive move. We felt it was justified for that reason, and probably a couple others. But and both Ken and I are totally against intervention. We're not interventionists. We're in the War Powers Caucus, for Pete's sakes. But the reality is he had the authority to do it, we felt, and he did it. And quite frankly, if he hadn't done it, there would have been far more damage and explanations necessary for why he did not take out this very, very dangerous individual.
Well said. Very well said.
Thank you.
So we're into our last question, the final question, and we're not going to be talking politics for this last question,
okay.
Unless you bring politics in. So this isn't a domestic or foreign policy question. It's a little bit more about, who's Andy Biggs and things important to you. So the question is this: if you could have dinner with any two deceased individuals, who would the two individuals be, and where would you have the dinner?
Well, I think one would be, I'd pick a religious leader, and there's several within my faith that I would be interested in having come. So I'd pick someone from there, and then I'd probably pick a political leader from the past. And there's one of I'd have to choose between Madison and Jefferson, from the political side, and then from my religious side, who I would choose, someone there. And then where the dinner would take place is. If it was Jefferson, maybe Monticello would be appropriate to eat at Monticello. And if it was Madison, I think I would like to go to a diner somewhere back home, a couple of diners that I have. And then with religious leaders, I think I'd want to do an outdoor dinner, like a barbecue or something like that, just a little bit more casual.
So Jefferson and Reagan are the top two answers that we get. We've hosted 16 of these so far.
Yeah.
Those are definitely the two of the top people that we get. So you're in good company in mentioning Jefferson. Yeah. So Congressman, thank you for being with us today. We've reached the time limit for today's conversation, but on behalf of our organization, the Iranian Americans for Liberty, my board, all of our supporters, I really want to thank you for taking the time to connect with us and share with the community your positions on domestic and foreign policy issues. But before we wrap up, would love to give you an opportunity to give some brief closing remarks. So tell us, what's your message to the Iranian American community that's listening?
Well, I would say don't give up hope. I think that it's easy to get to despair when you see what's going on in your homeland, Iran, but also even what's happening here. I mean, don't let this stuff conflate and bring you down. I think that there's reason to hope, and I think that reason to hope is the American people, and you have an opportunity to influence outcomes here in a way that ultimately may bode well for Iran in the future. And by the way, this organization, I think, is going to be helpful in doing that. So don't give up your guys' mission and keep fighting that fight.
Thank you, Congressman, for the kind words. We certainly appreciate it. And thank you again for making the time to be with us. And thank you to all of you, the audience, for tuning into our conversation with Congressman Biggs, also Chairman Biggs. But until next time, remember to lead with liberty at every turn possible, and have a good evening, and thanks for being with us.